Welcome to #CNF, a conversation about reading and writing with authors in the genre of creative nonfiction. I'm Brendan O'Mara. Harrison Scott Key is the winner of Creative Nonfiction's Southern Sin Essay Prize for his story The Wishbone, which is about his father suiting up a too-old Harrison to play Pee-wee football to win a coveted game against rival Pearl. If it sounds funny, that's because it is. Key's wit and humor permeate the essay to keep the reader turning to see just what he and his father will do next in the high-stakes world of football in the South. Key's work has appeared in the Oxford American, The Pinch, Swink, Defenestration, The Chronicle of Higher Education, and teaches at the Savannah College of Art and Design. It is my great pleasure to welcome the author of The Wishbone, Harrison Scott Key, to #CNF.
Well, thanks for inviting me, man. I'm excited to be here.
Great. And at what point did you know you had the elements of a great essay here?
Well, this is a story that I have been telling for a long time. Most of my essays, at least the memoir pieces from 20, 30 years ago, are stories that I had been telling to a lot of people, sitting around a campfire or sitting on someone's front porch or at a party or something, and the story would just come up because of whatever subject. And I found, this was even before I was a writer, before I was really trying to write some of these stories down, I just found that I was telling them over and over again. So I think when I started to write, and once I realized that memoir and autobiography is really probably what I should be writing, I had this huge, bucket of stories that I've been telling for so long, and it was really just a matter of knowing the stories were good, just trying to find out how to get the goodness out, and not make them too long, and to pick and choose the right details.
Right, and is that kind of how you flush out your story ideas? Is just by maybe just essentially sitting around a campfire and talking to friends and family, and then just realizing, hey, this actually has the elements of something pretty darn good.
Yeah, you've got these, I think everybody has these kind of seminal moments, these kind of crazy memories from your childhood. Everybody's got them, and, some people just forget them. They just kind of get glossed over. Like the football story, the Wishbone. This is a story that I probably did not want to think about too much right after it happened, because it was kind of embarrassing and weird, and, unlike writers, most people have to take the strange thing that happens to them and, I won't say, suppress it, but you have to kind of explain it away because you're trying to, feel normal, right? So the weird thing that happens, you don't want to talk about its weirdness. You kind of want to make it seem normal like the rest of you. And so I think, right after a lot of these stories happen, I didn't think about them, and I didn't think they were funny. They were, horrifying and terrible and weird and embarrassing. But then, 5-10 years go by. I find myself in college or graduate school, and I kind of get horrified when I remember, I remember that thing that my dad made me do that time. Oh my gosh, that was so weird, and I had totally forgotten about that. I have conversations with people all the time from my childhood and that I went to school with, and about crazy things that happened to us that I didn't even remember. And then as soon as they, brought them up, it kind of all comes back to me. But once I have an idea, I just take out a piece of paper and I just start writing down everything I can remember about that idea. I don't really outline so much as just start writing down every detail I remember. I think, I don't know who it was, maybe Eudora Welty said, when we write, we remember, and then, the more we remember, the more we write. And, you can find, they're kind of like little, breadcrumbs that lead you from one memory to the next. Like, trying to remember what day something happened on. You can't remember it all, then all of a sudden you remember what show you were watching when the thing happened, and then you go on Google and you find out that in that year that show aired on Tuesdays, and then all of a sudden you're starting to kind of piece together a story. So I just write everything down that I can remember, and then I start trying to tell the story to the paper just the way I would tell it to somebody at a bar or at a party. Mm-hmm. And it takes shape. Of course, you're going to write 30 drafts of it, so it's like you're retelling the story 30 times. Yeah. That's how it works.
Yeah, there was a great exercise that a professor of mine had in college. It was a memoir class, and she had us just lay out a timeline, and just from certain years, and you would write down just this certain thing happened in 1989. You're thinking, oh yeah, I was playing with Ninja Turtles and all this, that, and the other, and then all of a sudden, I was playing Ninja Turtles, and then you realize like who you were friends with at the time, and all of a sudden the mosaic starts to fill in on itself. So I totally understand where you're coming from in that instance.
People ask me how I remember so much, and I mean, I guess it's just like working out or something. The more you do it, the more you remember. And of course, how much can you trust memory? That's a tough call. I think I felt a lot more uncomfortable with how much I remembered and how accurate it was earlier in my career. I think what I started realizing is that, look, if there were people who were there, if I let them read the story or an early draft of the story, there might be some huge detail that they don't remember that I do. So if I'm very confident in my memory, I'm going to leave it in there. Mm. But I also want there to be room for argument. And so, like my mom, she will, reads all my stuff, and she will frequently say, oh, I don't remember that. What I remember was this. And then when she says that, I'm like, oh, I totally forgot about that. And then that works its way into the story too. So, you can do your own fact checking. But my whole theory on, the accuracy of childhood memories is that as long as if somebody who was at that scene or in that moment or in your life at the time, if they read it, they can disagree with it. They can say okay, the way I explain it, I'll try to be focused here. Okay, so if I'm sitting around the dinner table with my family, and that's we tell a lot of stories, and we frequently argue about what actually happened. I mean, this was before my becoming a writer. We would be telling some, deer hunting story, and I would say, well, I remember this happened, and I came up to the deer stand, and my dad was doing this, and my brother's like, no, he wasn't doing that. That was me. He was at the other place. And so we kind of have this argument, and of course it's friendly. We're not yelling at each other. But I think there's room for that kind of weird disagreement in memoir. Like, I'm telling my version of the story, and as long as you don't say it in such a way as to, make somebody storm off away from the table because they hate you because they think you're lying. Like, there's got to be room for disagreement, but I think readers can tell, or I think, family members can tell when it's just misremembering and when it's like an outright case of distorting the truth intentionally.
Right. And when your father approached you to be the ringer on this Pee Wee team, do you think it was so he could see his son dominate, if only once, and even if it was against kids who hadn't quite hit puberty yet?
I think, deep down, what dad doesn't want to see his son kick some butt in football, no matter what the rules are, how old they are. But I really, for him, it was just a pragmatic thing. It was just he didn't have enough players to make his team, and he was going to have to forfeit his game. And so the most natural thing in the world was for him to say, well, I've got this son, and he doesn't look too much older than these other kids, so you can put a helmet on him, and he just looks like, he's got a growth problem or something,
right.
And he can play. So, for him, it was totally pragmatic. It was just, we need to play this game. He probably thought it was the moral thing to do because otherwise we'd have to send all of his other teammates, all the other players home.
Right, and has your father gotten a chance to read the essay?
Yeah, he doesn't read a lot. My mom sometimes makes him read my stories.
Yeah.
Actually, I think she read it to him because she said it was too long for him to read by himself. Mm-hmm. He read it, and he said, hey, I read your story, I thought it was pretty funny, and that was about it, which is his way of saying, my mom, your mother said I had to tell you that I read your story. She reads it, and she's like my mom is like the family fact checker for me. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I don't think he gets what I do, but I also think that doesn't really matter. It's not a big deal to me.
Where did you find and hone your comedic sensibility?
You mean how did I what did I do to get better or funnier, that kind of thing? Yeah,
and also, where was the origins of that? Some people come to comedy as a way of defraying insult, as a self-defense mechanism in some cases, or other people are just drawn to comedy and then they just they start developing their own voice.
Well, I think I've always been a cut-up. I used to always get in trouble in school for talking too much in class. That was always my worst grade. I got an unsatisfactory for talking in class all the time. So I think I was always a talker and a joke teller and, trying to, to be cute, as my mother would say, and, command an audience in some form. But, I was picked on a lot or I say a lot. I don't think I was bullied or picked on any more than anyone else, but I do remember getting picked on in elementary school and junior high. I had really big ears, I had a giant head, and my ears were just huge. In fact, my ears have not grown at all since I was about 5 years old, and if you look at them now, they kind of fit my head size, but they were huge. I had all kind of nicknames, Radar and Dumbo and Satellite, and I think this is also in Mississippi where, everybody has a nickname anyway, so, they might be making fun of you, but they're also making fun of everyone else at the same time. Mm-hmm. But I think I realized that, people, I had an older brother who was at my school, too, and, we played sports, and we were, had a deer camp, and, when you're around guys in the locker room or at a hunting club or something, everybody's making fun of everybody. You kind of have to grow a pretty thick skin, and since I wasn't really, I wasn't, mean. I wasn't going to fight anybody. I wasn't a violent kid. I think I just realized that if you could make fun of them, too, that you could kind of, they would respect you a little bit more. And so I think I cultivated my sense of humor that way. There's a lot of sarcasm on a baseball team and a football team, and you have to get used to it. So I think I did. I think I was naturally funny, or at least naturally wanting to be funny, and then that was just cultivated. That was my defense mechanism. Other people in Mississippi have guns or knives or something, but for me, it was just being funny. And if somebody made fun of me, if I could then make fun of him and get all of his friends to laugh at him, they would all like me more, and then he wouldn't hurt me because his friends all of a sudden liked me because I was being funny. So yeah, I definitely cultivated as I grew up, and I did a lot of plays and stuff in college, but just because naturally I just wanted somewhere to be, a stage to perform Shakespeare and that kind of thing, and I did stand up for a little while in graduate school, and I did comedy improv, and I was okay at that stuff. It really was hard. Comedy improv was awesome, but it was so much work, and stand up was the same way. But I really enjoyed writing material for the stand up and writing plays or monologues to perform, and that's really how I got into writing prose and essays, is just realizing that, all the funny things you're saying in class or all the funny things you're saying to your friends, there's a way to turn that into a story. There's a way to go to school for that, to teach that, to make a living doing that, and it took a long time to realize that, I could make a living doing something that was pretty fun for me to do just naturally.
And what are some of the pitfalls of the writer who tries to be funny and misses? Because that's about as skin-cringing a moment as there is in writing and in performance, I imagine.
Being funny is really hard. I would consider myself a pretty funny person, and have always been pretty. I'm sure there are a lot of people who think I'm an idiot and a jackass, and don't think I'm funny at all. But I've always made some people laugh, and even that, even for me, finding a way to be funny on the page took a long time. I mean, it probably took me 10 years of, writing for 3 hours a day to figure out a way to be as funny in prose as I was doing comedy improv or doing monologues or something like that. And the pitfalls are it's not funny, right? Like, yeah. I mean, you have to write funny jokes and funny descriptions. And I teach a humor class here at SCAD, and these students that I've had this term, they are super talented. They're great writers, and you can tell when you interact with them that they're pretty funny people, or they're sarcastic, they're ironic, but on the page it was just painful. It was really hard for them to figure out a way that just because they said funny things to their friends while they're sitting around at a coffee shop doesn't mean that they can write in that same way. And of course, they got much better as the term progressed, and their last pieces were awesome and publishable. But you just have to write funny stuff, and you have to write things that you read out loud. And I mean, nobody laughs, and that's what's so great about writing humor, is that you have an immediate barometer for whether or not it's successful. I mean, if you read a lyric essay, something thoughtful, something reflective, it might be sad, or it might be dramatic, or it might just be suspenseful. But when you read it, nobody reacts, and there's no audible, visceral reaction. You can't tell in an audience, whether or not the piece was successful. Or at least it's hard to. You can tell by how loud they applaud, I guess, at the end. But in a humor piece, that's what's so fantastic about it, is that if it's not working, you'll just hear crickets, and it's just something about that really raises the stakes for me. I really love the fact that I really write all my stuff to be read out loud, or at least envision at some level, whether I'm reading it out loud at a reading, or whether somebody just really likes it in a magazine and wants to read it to their friends, right? And I always try to imagine, what does it sound like, and are there enough laughs? Like, is there a laugh? If it's a humor piece, then there better be something funny every 30 or 60 seconds, right? Every page better have a couple of good laughs on it. And I love the intensity of knowing that when I read it, if you read a funny piece for an audience and they don't laugh, I mean, it's painful. And, I think, to answer your earlier question about, like, what are the pitfalls, like, how do you learn how to do that? How horrible is that? I did speech writing for a long time, I guess for about 5 or 6 years. And the person that I wrote speeches for, she said, well, there needs to be a few laughs in this next speech. I had written just a few for her. I just started the job. And she said, we need to have a few laughs here, have a couple of moments of levity so the audience can relax, that kind of thing. And I had already written a couple of mildly funny essays by that time in my career, but I really hadn't written, like, a speech for somebody else, a real person is supposed to be funny. And, oh my gosh, it was so hard. It was nerve-wracking because this other human being, was going to take my words and go up in front of 500 people and deliver a line. And this person was not a comedian. They were, a leader. And, they were somebody who often gives speeches, but they're not a comedian. And the intensity of knowing, gosh, if this person fails, it's not just me, it's them. They're the one who fails. And so I would, so what I would do is I would write 3 or 4 different bits or different jokes that could then be inserted into the speech, and I would show them to her, and I'd say, do you find any of these funny? Are they kind of funny? And she'd X out 3 of them and then circle one. And then she'd say, this is okay, and so we keep working on it. And you really have to tweak everything. You have to tweak the syntax, and you have to make sure the tone is right. I tend to be, I think, a little too mean or cold-hearted or cruel in my humor, at least in the early drafts. I tend to be too mean to myself and to other people that I'm describing. And so I find that, as I revise, the meanness, I try to kind of wash the meanness out and just make it as true as possible. And of course, sometimes the truth does hurt, but it doesn't have to. Sometimes I find that I would be being a little acid or a little cruel just for no reason. It wasn't even funny. And so when I was writing these jokes and these speeches, I found that sometimes my sense of humor was just a little too harsh, and I'd have to pull back and make it a little more sophisticated. I think the first funny speech I wrote for this person, I got a few laughs, and you're sitting in the wings, and you're holding a copy of the speech, and you're, you're sweating bullets. It's awful. And, the person comes off, the applause happens, and she says, I think that was pretty good, and you go, okay, and you recover your pulse, and, you don't die, and the next time it gets a little bit better and a little bit better, and, after a few years, I was able to write, 5 and 6 jokes per page, things that felt natural within the speech itself, that felt honest, and that experience was so key to me then being able to write my own funny memoir humor, just knowing that, like, you have to know what's going to be funny to somebody else. It's not, you can't be writing, they always say you got to write for yourself, and I guess there's truth to that, but, I mean, I don't know, you really have to write and think, like, you have to think about your ideal reader, and are they going to think this is funny? And if you look at your stuff and you go, is this really funny? If the answer is probably not, then it probably isn't, and you have to take it out, and you just have to keep trying, and it takes a long time.
Yeah, and do you ever get a sense that some of your students that just in being breezy and as people, you said that they're funny and entertaining to be around, but when they try to put it on the page, that it comes across as just trying too hard?
Yeah, I mean, that's what failed humor tends to be, right? I mean, it's always trying too hard, because if you're not trying at all, then it's not even humor. It's just words. It's just a paragraph.
Yeah.
I think what happens when it's forced, when it's the worst humor is the forced kind, whether it's a pun or something corny, a play on words. The kind of humor where everybody groans, like, oh, okay, like, we get it, like, that's forced stuff, and you can tell. I can look back at early stuff that I wrote, and it was just so forced. I was just, because you're really just grappling at anything you can find to get a laugh, and it just takes a really long time to find your voice. I mean, there's so many things that are happening in a work of literature anyway, not just. Even stuff that's not funny, right? Mm-hmm. There's so much that's happening. You're trying to describe physical objects in a way that seems real and believable. You're trying to communicate an idea of who a person is, or what's happening in this particular moment, or what you're thinking, or what someone is thinking. And to be doing all of that, and in a way that makes people laugh, is, it's a little bit like juggling while you're riding a bike. It's just something that even, I'd say even 5 years ago, I might be able to write a funny tweet or a funny Facebook update. And sometimes with my students, not in every class, but I've had them do that because the stakes are so low. You're just writing 140 characters. Of course, it's still hard to get a laugh. I mean, it's really hard to get a laugh in 140 characters, but the idea that it's so short, I think, is lessens the pressure on them a little bit to do all the other things that a story or an essay has to do, just to say, look, you've got one little paragraph for a Facebook update or one little sentence for a tweet, and you just have to say something funny. Now, of course, in the class, we do, I did learn, I think as I was learning how to write, I learned some of these techniques that other funny people use, and some of the people that I really love to read are like Anthony Lane, the film critic for the New Yorker. He is so funny, and he's not funny in every piece. I mean, if he really likes a movie, he's usually not going to make fun of it. But he really hates a movie, like his reviews of Pearl Harbor from like 10 or 12 years ago, his reviews of some of the Star Wars movies, his review of Speed 2, which was like in 1995 or something. These are classic works of contemporary humor. They're so funny. And so, as I was learning to write, like the way he describes characters and scenes in movies is hilarious, and they're easily applicable to describing characters and scenes in fiction or characters and scenes in your own life. And I started learning some of these things just from reading reading his work and the work of others. But now in my classes, of course, I kind of reverse engineer it, and I try to show the students, like, before they're funny, I try to show them, like, here's how the other people are doing it. So, like, you take somebody like Jack Handy, who writes for the New Yorker, and I don't know if he still writes for Saturday Night Live or not. He used to. He had Deep Thoughts by Jack Handy, which was big in the late 80s and the early 90s. His technique is understatement or litotes, which is just and also dramatic irony, right? So in a lot of Jack Handy's humor, his speakers are clueless. They have no idea what they're saying. They're usually very confident, and they're very dumb. Mm-hmm. And to be able to show that to a student, or and then say, okay, so write me a character who's very confident in what he's saying, but completely stupid. And what's so great about dramatic irony is that the reader knows that this person's an idiot. That's how it works, and that's why they call it irony. The reader is aware that the speaker doesn't know what he's talking about, and we get some sort of weird, sick pleasure from feeling like we know more than what a character knows. And so being able to show students that, and then say, okay, let's see if we can find this in literature, because dramatic irony exists in not just in humor writing, it exists in all kinds of literature, and then to try and do that themselves. And so in some ways, it's really hard to say, like, okay, write something funny. Well, what is that? What does that even mean? Like, natural humorists, people who are just naturally funny, a stand-up comedian, an actor, in comedies, like somebody who is naturally funny, they don't have to have names for what they do. They just do it. They just have an instinct for it. But in a classroom setting, or for somebody who really wants to get better at it, it's really good to come up with some names for these techniques and say, okay, this is dramatic irony, this is verbal irony, this is misdirection, this is hyperbole, and then to see how people like George Saunders or Anthony Lane or David Sedaris or Bill Bryson or Simon Rich or Charles Portis, to see how they do these things, and then to try and imitate. And you're going to imitate, and it's going to suck real bad, but hopefully over the years it sucks less and less, and I don't know, 5-10 years later you've got something that's actually funny that people want to publish.
Yeah, it's funny you brought up Bill Bryson, because I just finished reading his memoir, The Life and Times of the Thunderbolt Kid, and it's hysterical, especially in the early goings when he'll be describing. He'll be like, yeah, the neighborhood kids. We went out there and we were playing a football game, and there were easily 3 million kids on the field.
Right.
and it's just that one little hyperbolic statement that it's coming through the 7-year-old lens, and it's just a very simple thing, but it's hysterical on its face, even though it's just completely ludicrous.
Well, like in that line, okay, so there's two things happening in that line. So first of all, Bryson is saying what his 7-year-old self thought, right? That the 7-year-old self was so overwhelmed by how many kids were on the field. We as readers know that the 7-year-old the 7-year-old is wrong, right? There aren't that many kids.
Yep.
But we also have pleasure in knowing that we know a little bit more than this little 7-year-old idiot does, right? So there's some pleasure. That's dramatic irony. We're getting pleasure from knowing more than this stupid person. Of course, the kid's 7, so it's okay that he's stupid, but we enjoy that. And then there's hyperbole, like you say, with the 7 million or whatever the number was. And so, just to be able to do that, I think people can do it. Funny people can do that more naturally when they talk, but to do that when you write is it feels so much more complicated. You really have to be really loose, when you're writing, because I think we're so used to being truthful. When I say truthful, I mean like logically, literally truthful when we write, whether it's because of, our good-hearted English teachers, God bless them, from junior high and high school and college. We're trying to be as literal as possible. We're trying to be as clear as possible when we write a sentence or write a paper about Dostoevsky or write a paper about politics. And when you're writing humor or really any kind of literature, you're not being literal. You have to be loose. You have to describe things in ways that aren't lowercase t true, right? But like that, to say there were easily 7 million people on the field, if you write that in an English class, English composition, your teacher's going to say, or were there 7 million people, or was it more like 30, or was it more like 20? The humor writer and the writer of literature has to feel loose enough to say, first of all, the reader is going to know there weren't 7 million people, right? You naturally know that because you're reading a book. You're not an idiot. But to be loose enough and comfortable enough as a writer to make up something that's clearly not true, but in the service of some larger idea. For example, that obviously the 7-year-old is so overwhelmed by how many people are on the field that he conceives of it as being, the population of New York City. That it takes a lot of confidence for a writer to get to a point where they can exaggerate like that confidently without looking like they're just making something up.
Yeah, Hemingway has said something to the effect that a writer has to take a beating to write a really funny book. I was wondering what your feelings were about that statement.
Well, there's the old saying that comedy equals tragedy plus time. I mean, I guess that's true. But everybody. I mean, first of all, there's no good story where somebody's not taking a beating, right? I mean, bad things happen in every story, in every book of the Bible, in every play by Shakespeare, in every good poem. Something bad is happening, or has happened, or will happen, and is being thought about or experienced, right? Mm-hmm. And so, I'm trying to think of what E.B. White said. He's got this essay called Some Remarks on Humor, and he says something to the effect of that, a humorist will make pain pay. That a humorist will take the terrible thing that happens, and you turn it into, you redeem it a little bit. You turn it into something that we can all enjoy. I mean, you look at comedy, like most comedy, tragedy is about looking at death and acknowledging that you can't really escape it, right? Death is coming for us all, even our greatest heroes, Hamlet, that everybody's going to die, that death comes for us all. And comedy kind of is what happens next. So if death is coming for us all, if none of us can be noble and great and somehow cheat death, then what do you do? And what you do is comedy, right? So tragedy is the realization that we're all going to die, and comedy is, okay, so given that fact, how should we behave? And I really think that's, that all humor is about, terrible things. I tell my students that, humor really starts in either anger or anxiety. It's one of those two things. It's either you're really mad about something out there in the world, right, which is how we get satire, how we get The Daily Show. You're really mad about this ridiculous thing. And maybe mad is not always the best word. Maybe incensed, or maybe you're raging about it. Maybe you just sense there's some injustice, but it's external. And then the other kind of humor is internal. It's you're mad about something that's happening inside of you. You're anxious. You have fears. And so most humor feels like it comes from one of those two places. You're either really pissed off about something in the world, or really pissed off about something inside of you, and it's usually a little bit of both.
And you already touched upon this a little bit. Who are some of your writing influences from a pure comedic standpoint?
Well, I definitely have to say, I guess I would have to start with stand-up comics, because when I was little, those were the first funny people, I ever listened to, and I can remember, oh my gosh, I guess it was, Comic Relief from the 80s, maybe like 1985 or 86. Mm-hmm. I remember renting that on VHS, and, Robin Williams was on that, and George Carlin, and I think Robin Williams was really my first favorite comedian. And just the kind of insanity of his stuff, it got so absurd, and it was so frenetic. Maybe because he was doing so much coke, I'm not sure, but he never stopped, and there was never a breather, and it was just so energizing to watch, kind of mesmerizing. So I loved Robin Williams. I loved George Carlin. I really liked Richard Pryor, and who else? That guy with the long hair. Oh, Gallagher, who did put the watermelons. Yeah. Oh man, I used to love watching Gallagher. Now, it's pretty corny stuff, but I remember when I was a kid just being so mesmerized by that, even more than funny movies. I really loved watching comedy, and we didn't have cable or anything growing up, so every now and then you'd have a comedian on Star Search, if you remember Star Search. It was like the American Idol of the 1980s. And Sinbad was on there. There were some other comedians, so we would record Star Search and watch it. And occasionally there'd be like stand-up on like these weird shows on Saturday afternoon, and I would watch those religiously, and of course listen to Prairie Home Companion on the radio. And then, when I was in college, I think the first real funny book that I read was The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy by Douglas Adams. My roommate, Brian, gave that book to me, and I kind of thought it was like some kind of sci-fi nerd book, which I guess technically that's what it is. But But man, it was so funny, and it was so smart, and it was just doing these kind of magic tricks with your brain. Just even in the prologue. I mean, there's this great line about digital watches in the prologue to this, and when I read it, I remember exactly where I was sitting. I was sitting on my college campus, and it was a quiet day, and I just opened this book up. I guess I was bored, and it was just so funny and so unexpected that it was this kind of humor that I had heard comedians do, but here it was in book form, and I loved books. I mean, I've been reading my whole life, reading a book a week, and then to see that, oh wow, like that kind of funny can also happen here was really kind of blew my mind. And so, I think there's 5 books in that series, and I read all of those in about 2 weeks. And of course, I also was disillusioned with that book or with that series, because I remember by about book 3, it stopped being as funny. And I thought, well, maybe it's just me, so I found another funny novel, and I found another Terry Pratchett, Neil Gaiman, those guys. I don't know if that was back then or maybe it had been a few years later, but I remember thinking, I just got really hungry to find funny stuff, and I would ask everybody, and this is in college and then in graduate school, who are some funny writers? Who's writing funny novels? Who's writing funny essays, funny plays? And, of course, everybody thinks they know, right? So other writers or writing students or writing teachers would tell me, and they'd be like, oh, this book is so funny. You look on the back of the book, and it says, oh, laugh out loud funny, or you'll be rolling on the floor. And, I never would be. I'd read this stuff, and, a couple of pages might be funny, but I'm not going to wait. I don't want to waste, 12 hours of my life reading a book when I laugh 2 or 3 times. And it was really disheartening to me. And that's in one reason I started trying to write stuff is because I thought I want to write something that makes me laugh the whole way through, or as much of the way through as you can, and still be a good story. And the first book I read that was really like that for me was A Confederacy of Dunces, which I read, I guess, I don't know, I was in my early 20s, maybe 23 or 24 when I read that book. And that was another one that really kind of blew my mind, because it was just as funny as Hitchhikers, but it was also smart. There were big ideas in it about religion and philosophy and how humans should act, but it never took itself seriously. The writer didn't necessarily have those ideas so much as the characters did, and so just the idea of combining really big, huge, abstract philosophical thinking about how humans should be with humor was just awesome. And again, it was just kept whetting my appetite, trying to find something funny. And I read all the Woody Allen books, and Steve Martin had a book called Pure Drivel, and I read that. And then I started to see that there were different kinds of humor. That you've got your basic comic novel, like A Confederacy of Dunces or Hitchhiker's Guide. And Straight Man by Richard Russo is a terrifically funny novel. At least the first half of it is as good as anything I've ever read. So there's that. But then I realized there's also, of course, you've got nonfiction humor, you've got essays and memoir, but then you also have this kind of weird humor, like you see at McSweeney's Internet Tendency and on Shouts and Murmurs, that's not really so much a story, at least usually not a story, but, whether it's a list or a how-to or an open letter, or you have an inanimate object is talking to the reader. And so just to discover these different modes of humor and where to find them, and to realize which ones I was good at, which ones I was not quite as good at, which ones I wanted to write. But man, it's really everywhere. I mean, George Saunders, his stuff is both really funny and often really sad or really dark or really weird. His book, The Brain Dead Megaphone, has some hilarious essays in it. Nostalgia is a great essay. A Brief Study of the British is a great essay, but his book Pastoralia has some great stories, as do his other books, but Pastoralia has some really funny stuff that we read with my humor students. And these are stories that are really touching. They're not just it's not just fart jokes and potty humor and gross things happening and making fun of people. I mean, these are really human stories where crazy, weird, strange, sad things happen. And then, sometimes it ends well. Sometimes it ends on a positive note, and sometimes it ends on more of a question mark. But man, that guy has got something crazy, weird happening in his brain. And so I try to discover new stuff every week, and I try to share that with my students. And, everything you read should make you get better.
Well, you've definitely got a skill for it, and it was tremendously entertaining to read the Wishbone. Again, the Wishbone won the Creative Nonfiction Southern Sin Essay Contest. Be sure to subscribe to Creative Nonfiction to get your hands on Harrison's essays and many, many others. Harrison, it's been a great pleasure to have you on the show. Thank you so much for taking some time out of your afternoon.
Brendan, I really appreciate it. I hope I didn't talk your ear off, and I really appreciate what you're doing with the podcast. I think it's pretty great.